southern Belgium. 3:58 a.m. October 17, 1944. The fog lay over the road like wet cloth, heavy, cold, unwilling to move. Wind pressed through the tree-line in long, low notes, as if the forest itself was warning us away. Inside the cab of the lead truck, the engine vibrated through the pedals and into my legs. My palms were damp on the wheel. I kept my eyes fixed on the faint glow of the blackout lights ahead, the only thing keeping 54 trucks in a line on a mountain road that shouldn't have held more than one. I breathed out, and the air turned silver. 20 years old, Private Alan Whitford, nothing special. But that night the stillness felt wrong, too perfect, too staged. The kind of quiet that comes just before a door swings open and someone you don't see yet steps inside. Then something flickered in the tree-line. A brief metallic flash. A curve of light no longer than a blink. Could have been optics. Could have been wet bark. Could have been the moon catching a rifle sight. I straightened in my seat. My throat tightened. What was that? Metal? Glass? Or just my imagination again? Behind me, stretching into the dark, were trucks packed with 75mm shells and crates of explosives, enough to turn the entire convoy into a single rolling funeral pyre. And the question rose uninvited, the one that had followed me since Normandy. Why was I, just a driver, always the first to feel when something was wrong? By mid-October the Ardennes had settled into a kind of watchful stillness, the sort that made engines sound louder and mistakes feel heavier. Our convoy, Iron Line, 9th Army Supply, was the spine feeding 3 divisions pushing east. Ammunition, fuel, rations, spare parts, the whole front leaned on these roads like a man leaning on a cane that might snap at any step. Official doctrine was simple, stripped of imagination. Do not stop. Do not deviate. Do not question the printed route. Every driver heard it a dozen times before leaving the depot. Maps were treated like promises, straight lines, crisp symbols, neat arrows pointing toward victory. But the war I saw through the windshield wasn't neat. Roads washed out. Bridges sagged. Forests swallowed sound. And somewhere among those hills, German patrols still moved like shadows in water. The officers insisted the road ahead had been cleared by reconnaissance the previous afternoon. They said it without hesitation, as if weather, enemy movement, and night itself obeyed the schedules stamped on their paperwork. I'd driven these routes long enough to know that by dawn, yesterday's certainty could turn into today's funeral. Still, rules were rules. The army trusted the system, and the system trusted us to follow instructions without interpretation. We were not scouts. We were not combat engineers. We were wheels and cargo, meant to stay predictable so the front could rely on us. Any break in that predictability was treated like sabotage. As lead driver, my only job was to keep a steady pace and trust the line behind me to do the same. The blackout lights on the truck ahead were faint as insects, and the road curved like a snake pressed into the hillside. Drop-offs hid beneath the fog. Trees crowded close enough that their branches brushed canvas covers in passing, their wet leaves whispering against steel. To the men riding behind, this was another night run. Another cold haul across Belgium, another stretch of darkness to be endured until the next checkpoint. But from the first mile, something felt off. The silence wasn't natural. The forest had its own rhythm, creeks, distant birds, the murmur of water under frost. Tonight it felt like all of that had stepped aside to watch us pass. I kept my concerns to myself. A driver who hesitated made everyone nervous, and nervous men made mistakes. But the further we drove, the more the sense grew that the map and the land were no longer in agreement. The system said the sector was clear. My instincts, sharpened by months of hauling shells through places where maps lied, told me the opposite. I reminded myself of doctrine, the route is the route. Follow it, and you'll reach the front alive. But doctrine didn't see what I saw. It didn't feel the subtle wrongness, the weight of the fog, the strange stillness in the tree-line. It didn't notice how the wind carried a scent of cold earth disturbed too recently, as if something had moved where nothing should move at this hour. Somewhere between the depot and that mountain road, I began to sense the truth officers rarely admitted: the system worked only when the world cooperated. And the world, especially this corner of Belgium, had stopped cooperating long ago. Before the war, my world was smaller than any map the army ever handed me. Denver wasn't a city of noise back then, just long streets, low roofs, and the steady rhythm of engines coming apart and going back together under my father's hands. I grew up in that rhythm. Cold mornings in the shop, the concrete dusted with metal filings that glittered when the sun finally crept in. The scent of oil clinging to my clothes no matter how long I scrubbed. The familiar comfort of a socket wrench settling into my palm like an old coin. My father didn't teach with speeches. He taught by sound. Listen, he'd say, leaning close to a carburetor that coughed when it should have breathed. A machine will tell you what's wrong long before it breaks. You just have to respect the noise. I learned early that a wrong squeak, a stray rattle, a shift in pitch could say more than any manual. He'd close his eyes sometimes, just for a second, letting the engine speak. I copied him without realizing it, trying to hear what he heard. When I turned 16, he let me drive the old farm tractor on the county road. It wasn't fast, just stubborn, but it taught me something I didn't expect: how much the world changes in the mirrors. My father had a rule: check them every 10 seconds, no matter the road, no matter the speed. They're not to see who's chasing you, he told me. They're to remind you you're not alone out here. The habit stuck. Even years later, in a military truck with blackout lights so faint they barely existed, I still counted the seconds before checking the mirrors, letting the habit anchor me. I was not bold, not restless. I never dreamed of flying or charging into battle. My plans were simple: finish school, save enough to rent a small garage, fix other people's engines until my hands were too old to close around a wrench. But history has a way of setting its own course. After Pearl Harbor, boys who looked like me lined up outside recruitment offices with faces half determined, half uncertain. I stood in that line almost without thinking, as if the ground moved me there. The Army looked at my mechanic's background and sent me where engines needed constant forgiveness: motor pools, convoys, repair yards that smelled like burnt rubber and cold steel. I didn't mind. Machines made sense, even when nothing else did. A broken axle didn't lie to you. A cracked manifold didn't pretend to be anything other than cracked. Still, the war changed the way I listened. Back home, an odd noise meant inconvenience. Out here, it could mean fire on the horizon, a wheel blown off on a mined road, or a stalled engine at the exact wrong moment. Every mile sharpened the instincts I brought from Denver. Every convoy taught me that the smallest detail, the pitch of a motor, the way gravel shifted under wheels, the way silence stretched too long, could be the difference between a safe arrival and a crater in the earth with your name on it. I was ordinary. I knew it. A driver with good hands, decent sense, and no desire to be anything more. But ordinary men notice things. And war, for all its noise and confusion, rewards the ones who listen closely to what others ignore. Looking back, I think those early mornings in the garage prepared me more than any briefing or manual. Engines taught me vigilance. My father taught me caution. And the road taught me that the world rarely announces danger, it whispers it. All you can do is hear it in time. The contradictions began early in the route, small things at first, the sort of details a tired driver might ignore. But I'd spent too many years listening for the wrong kind of noise not to feel it settling under my skin. Just after we cleared the depot perimeter, the road dipped toward a narrow wooden bridge that crossed a shallow creek. I'd driven that same bridge 3 times in the past month. Its boards were usually dry and pale, weathered by sun and cold. But that morning, the planks were soaked dark, as if someone had thrown buckets of mud across them minutes before we arrived. No rain that night. No runoff. Just wet boards and prints in the silt that looked too fresh, too defined. I watched them blur under the tires and felt the first quiet alarm ring somewhere behind my ribs. A little farther on, we passed a cow lying on its side near the ditch, dead, but not in the way animals die on their own. It was positioned strangely, legs straight, as if placed there. No flies. No signs of decay. A living creature doesn't fall that neatly. Neither does a dying one. I slowed slightly as I passed it, studying the unnatural stillness, the way the frost clung only to certain patches of its hide. Something had happened to it recently, and not by chance. Behind me, a few of the boys noticed too. One of the drivers, Miller, from Ohio, leaned out his window just enough to mutter, "This silence is bad," thinking no one else could hear. The others laughed it off. The laughter didn't last long. The fog swallowed it almost immediately, thinning it into something brittle. I tightened my grip on the wheel and reached for the radio handset. For a second, I debated staying quiet. Rules were rules, and no one liked the lead driver making trouble. But instinct pressed harder than procedure. "Control, this is Convoy Bravo lead," I said. "Sector ahead looks suspicious. Requesting recon confirmation." Static answered first, crackling like ice snapping in the dark. Then a clipped voice came through, calm in that particular way only officers could manage when they weren't the ones on the road. "Bravo lead, route is clear. Recon checked the sector yesterday. Proceed as ordered." Yesterday. As if yesterday still meant something in a war that rewrote the map between sunset and dawn. I acknowledged, because that was the rule, but the unease didn't ease. It settled deeper instead, like a weight shifting to make room for itself. I could almost hear my father's voice, "If something doesn't sound right, don't trust the silence that follows." Ahead, the forest narrowed around the road. Branches drooped low under the fog, brushing the sides of the truck like fingers testing the canvas. My headlights threw a faint glow onto the gravel, catching the irregular patterns in the mud. Too many impressions, too many small disturbances. Not enough to make a claim. Enough to make a man watch the edges more closely. Behind me, the convoy rolled on, obedient, trusting the system that had sent us down this path. The official map said this road was secure. The radio repeated it. And the men laughed at my caution, saying I saw ghosts in every bend. But ghosts didn't bother me. Patterns did. Breaks in patterns did. And the Ardennes that morning felt wrong in ways I couldn't outline on paper. I kept scanning the mirrors every 10 seconds, habit, comfort, anchor. Each time, the faint glow of blackout lights lined up neatly behind me, identical, steady, calm. A perfect formation. A perfect target. I told myself to let it go. To trust the route. To believe the reconnaissance reports and the men who signed them. But belief didn't change the facts: the bridge too wet, the cow too cleanly dead, the forest too quiet, the air too still. And somewhere in the fog, something waited, something the maps didn't show and the radio didn't mention. Something that didn't match the system at all. The stretch before L Point was always slow, two shallow bends climbing along a ridge where the fog thickened and the trees leaned in as if listening. I'd driven it enough times to know the shape of every rise and hollow, but that morning the land felt unfamiliar, as though the night had rearranged it. The air turned colder, heavier. Even the engine note changed, muffled under the weight of the fog. As we neared the first curve, I caught a thin ribbon of smoke rising from the ground on the right side of the road, so faint it looked like the forest exhaling. But the soil was wet, heavy from dew. Nothing should have burned there. Nothing should have smoldered beneath mud. I slowed a fraction, letting the truck settle into a lower gear, and watched the smoke vanish into the fog like a signal withdrawn. The second curve, L Point proper, was a sharp S-bend carved into the slope, overlooked by dense pines. It was the perfect place for an ambush. Too perfect. Every unit that had ever passed through mentioned it in hushed tones, half joking about how it felt like a place where bad things waited. I'd shrugged it off before. But that morning, the bend seemed to watch us approach. Then I saw it, a piece of red cloth tied high on a tree trunk just beyond the bend. Not a scrap blown there by wind. Not a random rag. Knotted tight. Hanging still. A color too bright for the muted forest, too deliberate for chance. Someone had placed it recently. Someone who wanted it noticed, or wanted it missed. My breath thinned. Every instinct I carried from Denver's garages to Europe's roads gathered in one cold knot. Smoke in wet dirt. Signs placed where no one should be. Silence where animals should have moved. The map said the path ahead was safe. But the ground disagreed. As the truck rolled closer to the bend, the fog shifted just enough for me to glimpse the terrain beyond the roadside, the faint shimmer of disturbed soil lower down the slope, the kind of moisture pattern that comes when weight settles and heat meets cold. A small fire. Maybe two. Recently stamped out. An ambush site. Or something close enough that the difference no longer mattered. My eyes caught another detail, a narrow tractor road veering left, half hidden behind brush, swallowed by shadow and neglect. It wasn't on our map. Most drivers would have missed it entirely. But I remembered it from a resupply errand weeks earlier, a forgotten path leading toward an old fuel dump the engineers never finished. Rough, muddy, barely wide enough for a single truck. Unofficial. Unmarked. Unused. And right now, it looked like the only road that wasn't waiting to K*LLS. I checked the mirrors again. 54 trucks. 54 engines humming under the same blind faith. If I stayed on the marked road, we'd enter that bend exactly as the enemy intended, slow, stretched, predictable. A column of explosives presented like a gift. I gripped the wheel, feeling the rubber of the gloves strain at the knuckles. The rules were clear: stay on route. Never deviate. The consequences were clearer: disobedience meant punishment, maybe worse. But the forest didn't care about rules, and neither would the men waiting in it. My father's voice echoed from a decade away: if something squeaks wrong, it's calling you to look closer. Everything here squeaked wrong. The radio hissed softly, waiting for routine reports. My crew expected me to keep moving, to trust the ink on the map more than the ground beneath the tires. I could feel the decision tightening around me like a vice. Ahead, the red cloth hung motionless, bright against the gray. To the left, the hidden road waited, mud, branches, uncertainty. I had seconds. One bend. One choice. And I knew, with a clarity that felt cold enough to cut, if we followed the official route into L Point, the convoy would not come out alive. The wheel felt heavier than it should have, damp leather, cold steel, and the weight of a decision no manual had prepared me for. The official route curved right into the fog, into the waiting bend, into whatever had left smoke in the soil and red cloth on a tree. The tractor road, half swallowed by brush, opened left like a narrow throat cut into the hillside. Mud pooled in deep brown ruts. Branches arched low enough to scrape paint. Neither choice promised anything good. But only one offered the chance of still being alive 10 minutes later. I lifted the radio handset. My breath shook once, not from fear but from the clarity of what I was about to do. Orders were simple: stay on route, no deviations, no improvisation. Drivers who broke formation were disciplined hard. Lead drivers even more so. But behind me stretched 54 trucks carrying enough ammunition to light half the ridge on fire. My responsibility wasn't to a rule, it was to them. Convoy Bravo, I said, voice steadier than I felt, altering course. Taking route Delta 5. There was no route Delta 5. Not on any map. I invented it the moment I spoke it. Silence answered me, thick, uncertain, disbelieving. Then static cracked, followed by a voice I recognized from the third truck. Lead, say again. You're turning. I didn't reply. I turned the wheel. The truck lurched left, tires biting into mud. Branches slapped the canvas, scraping along the metal frame like fingernails dragged across sheet steel. The engine growled in protest, but it held. The fog thinned for a few feet, revealing the tight curve of the tractor path ahead, narrow, uneven, barely a road at all. For a heartbeat, I drove alone. Then, in the mirror, a second pair of blackout lights veered left. Someone had chosen to follow. A third set appeared. A fourth. The line shuddered, then bent with me, trucks swinging into the brush one by one like railcars pulled from a collapsing track. Not all at once, hesitation showed in every staggered turn, but they followed. I kept my speed low. Too fast and the mud would swallow us. Too slow and fear would. The branches pressed close, brushing the mirrors, tracing the sides of the trucks with wet strokes. Somewhere beyond the tree lean, distant and muffled, I thought I heard movement, boots, maybe, or something shifting against bark. But it faded as we crawled deeper into the narrow path. Behind me, a driver muttered over the radio, "Lead, HQ's calling for route confirmation. They want to know why we're off-grid." I didn't reach for the handset. I couldn't tell them what I knew, not without proof, not without sounding like a frightened kid inventing ghosts. The truth was simpler: something waited on that bend, and I refused to deliver 54 trucks to it. The mud thickened, *king at the wheels. The path dipped, then climbed in a slow, grinding slope. My hands tightened on the wheel with each jolt, each shudder of the suspension. But every yard we traveled made the decision feel less like madness and more like inevitability. "Whitford," someone said over the radio, "if this goes wrong." "It hasn't yet," I cut in. A long pause followed. No argument. No complaint. Just the sound of engines straining through mud, one after another, trusting the lead truck without understanding why. In the fog-dimmed mirrors, the convoy looked unreal, faint glimmers of light drifting between trees, barely visible, like a line of fireflies forced into single file. 54 trucks, each carrying enough explosive force to erase us from the hillside, crawling up a forgotten road because a driver with no rank worth mentioning decided the map was lying. The army had rules. I had instinct. And that instinct told me I had just pulled all of us off a cliff, only hoping the ground would be there when we landed. But I kept driving. Not because I was sure I was right. Because if I was wrong, at least we'd die moving, not waiting. We had been on the tractor road for maybe 6 minutes, though it felt like we had been crawling through that narrow throat of mud and branches for an hour. The world outside the windshield had shrunk to a tunnel of wet limbs and fog, the engine's steady rumble the only thing keeping my nerves from fracturing. If anyone behind me doubted the turn, they didn't say it. Engines spoke louder than voices, and those engines kept following. Then the world behind us tore open. A single boom, deep, heavy, rolled through the hills, followed by a second that cracked the fog like lightning. The air behind us glowed faintly orange, a soft flicker pushing between trees. I stopped breathing. I didn't need a radio report to know where the explosions came from. L point. Seconds later, the radio erupted, shouts, static, frantic voices layering over each other. Ambush at the bend, trucks burning, God, they hit the lead. Multiple detonations, ammo trucks are gone, repeat, gone. Small arms fire, fall back, fall back. I close my eyes only long enough to steady myself. We should have been there. The whole column should have been rolling into that bend at the exact moment the first blast went off. By the system's design, we were supposed to be in the K*LL pocket. But we weren't. The fog parted just enough for me to see more clearly the faint orange glow licking upward behind distant trunks. The sound carried strangely, dull thuds, crackling canvas, the stutter of machine G*N fire. The kind that didn't aim to frighten but to finish any survivors. I shifted into a lower gear and pushed forward. The men behind me deserved momentum, not reflection. They would understand the cost later. The path tightened again. Branches clawed the truck sides, scraping hard enough to peel paint. The mud deepened around the tires, churning in slow circles. I kept one hand firm on the wheel and one on the shifter, guiding the truck through the narrow rise where the hillside pinched inward. Then movement flickered ahead, shadows breaking against the fog. My pulse spiked. For a moment I thought we had driven straight into another trap. But it wasn't enemy movement. It was water, shallow, boggy ground glistening in the dim light, pooling in a depression the tractor path skirted by only a few feet. Fresh tracks scarred the mud, wide, heavy, angled sharply into the marsh. German. A scout unit had tried to cut us off. Their vehicles had bogged down in the soft earth, half-submerged, abandoned in haste. Dark shapes slumped in the reeds where men had struggled free and fled. Their engines sat tilted like wounded beasts, hoods half open, metal warped from their last attempts to break free. If I had taken the map route, we would have met them head-on. If I had turned 30 seconds later, they might have reached the tractor path in time. But the timing, pure accident or pure instinct, had locked us into a gap they couldn't match. The radio hissed again. A younger driver asked, voice thin, "Lead, what do we do now?" "Keep moving," I said. "Stay tight. Don't stop for anything." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Calm carried its own authority. The path wound upward, turning through a stand of pines that formed a natural corridor. The convoy followed in single file, engine steady, blackout lights faint but unwavering. 54 trucks, each one a possible ignition point, threading through the forest like a slow pulse of steel. Behind us, L point continued to burn. The glow spread through the fog, transforming the trees into stark silhouettes. The explosions came less frequently now, single pops, secondary detonations from scattered ammunition crates catching fire. We drove on until the forest finally widened into a clearing where the mud thinned and the road leveled. Only then did I allow myself a breath deep enough to feel. We were intact. Every truck. Every man. The system had sent us into a K*LL zone. The land had whispered otherwise. And for once, I had listened loudly enough to matter. We reached the Arduin Forge staging area just after dawn, the sky a flat gray sheet pulling light reluctantly over the clearing. The trucks rolled in one by one, engines coughing from the strain of the tractor road, mud packed into wheel wells like cement. Men climbed down stiffly, some silent, some staring at the forest we had crawled out of as if expecting it to change its mind and pull us back. I stayed in the cab until the last truck stopped moving. Only then did I step onto solid ground. My legs trembled, not from fear, not from the decision, but from the sudden absence of tension. When you carry 54 trucks behind you, the weight settles in your bones. When you finally stop, it leaves you hollow. The quiet didn't last. A sergeant hustled over, boots slapping the mud. "Whitford, command wants you. Now." I followed him into a low corrugated shed that served as the forward operations office. Inside, 2 officers waited, a captain with eyes sharp as broken glass, and a major whose expression carried the calm of someone who had run out of illusions months ago. The captain spoke first. "Private, you violated a direct route order. You diverted an entire convoy without authorization. You understand the severity of that?" "Yes, sir." "Then tell me why." I met his stare but didn't embellish. "Because the route wasn't safe." "On what grounds?" His voice sliced the air. "Recon cleared the sector." "With respect, sir," I said, "the ground disagreed." His jaw tightened. For a moment I thought he might lunge across the table. Before he could speak, the major raised a hand. "Captain," the major said quietly, "L point was hit at 0451. Half a battalion's worth of vehicles burned. If this man followed your paper route, we'd be collecting tags instead of cargo. The captain fell silent, though the anger stayed locked in his posture. Procedure had been broken. Outcomes didn't change that. The major studied me for a long moment. What exactly did you see, Private? I told him, every detail, from the wet bridge planks to the cow laid too neatly by the road, to the smoke curling from wet soil, to the red cloth hanging like a warning someone hoped we wouldn't understand. I didn't dramatize anything. I didn't apologize. When I finished, the major nodded once, as if confirming a suspicion he already held. You acted on instinct, he said. Some men have it. Some don't. The captain muttered, instinct doesn't belong in a convoy. Sometimes, the major replied, it's the only thing that keeps a convoy alive. They dismissed me without commendation, without reprimand, just a thin envelope of silence I carried back into the cold. Outside, the drivers clustered near their trucks, voices low. When I appeared, the line parted slightly. Men watched me with expressions I couldn't read, relief, disbelief, maybe a touch of fear. Then a driver from the rear column stepped forward, a man built like farm machinery, with grease stains etched into his sleeves. My hand was on the wheel, he said. When you turned, I figured, if you go, I go. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. Later, as mechanics scraped mud from the frames and supply officers counted crates that should have never reached dawn, I walked the line of trucks. Engines ticked softly as they cooled. Canvas covers fluttered in the breeze. Some men slept on their tailgates, others leaned against the wheels, staring at nothing with the brittle stillness of people who just avoided a death they hadn't yet processed. No medal waited. No report would praise what we did. The army didn't celebrate deviation, even when it saved lives. Officially, the convoy had unexpectedly rerouted due to environmental obstruction. Unofficially, the truth passed in quiet nods and the occasional hand on my shoulder. I didn't feel heroic. I felt tired. The kind of tired that sits in you long after the mud has been washed off the tires and the smoke has drifted away. The kind that makes you wonder how close the world came to turning dark and final in a single bend of road. One turn. One choice. And the knowledge that nothing in the rulebook had prepared me for either. War moved on. Convoys kept rolling. New routes were drawn, old ones closed, and the road that nearly ended us faded back into the forest as if it had never been there. In the weeks that followed, I was assigned to other runs, fuel hauls, ration deliveries, artillery transfers. Nothing special. The army didn't change its doctrine for one night of instinct. The rules stayed the rules: do not stop. Do not deviate. Do not question the route. But men remembered. Not loudly, not with ceremony. In war, recognition lived in the smallest gestures: a seat saved at the fire barrel, a mechanic offering a fresh set of gloves without explanation, a driver adjusting formation a little closer to your bumper on cold nights. They treated me differently, though no one ever named the difference. When danger brushed the edges of a road, eyes drifted toward the lead truck, toward me. Not for orders. For reassurance that I was still listening to the same quiet signals they had learned to trust. Once, weeks after the ambush, a quartermaster approached while I was checking tire pressure. He asked, almost casually, "You really saw smoke in the dirt?" "Yes," I said. He nodded as if confirming something private. "Then it's good you were up front." He walked away without another word. There were no official commendations. No letters home from command. No handshake from someone with stars on his shoulder. The army kept its records neat, its story simple. When the report on supply line number 47 was filed, the summary read only: convoy rerouted due to unexpected terrain conditions, all cargo delivered intact. No mention of the bend, the ambush, the abandoned German vehicles buried in the marshland we'd skirted by inches. But stories travel where reports cannot. Mechanics told new recruits about a driver who felt an ambush before it happened. Drivers whispered pieces of the tale during long night hauls, each version stripped of names but heavy with implication. Some called it luck. Some called it nerves. A few said it was nothing more than coincidence dressed up in hindsight. I didn't argue. I didn't claim anything. The truth wasn't a story, it was a moment, a turn made because silence felt wrong and the air carried a tension you couldn't see on a map. After the war, I went home. Denver hadn't changed much, the shop still smelled of old oil and cold mornings, the tools still hung where my father left them. I took over the garage, patching up trucks and tractors, listening to engines the way he taught me. Customers sometimes asked if the war had changed me. I told them the same thing every time: the roads are quieter here. Years blurred. One winter, while visiting a friend in Missouri, I wandered through the Transportation Corps Museum. It wasn't large, just a collection of fields, engines, supply crates, and quiet plaques. I wasn't looking for anything. I didn't expect anything. But near the back corner, behind a display of convoy routes, I saw a small printed card mounted under glass. Supply line number 47, preserved in full due to an unofficial deviation by lead driver. No name. No details. No story. Just a single sentence, dry as chalk, acknowledging that something had happened in a place where the official route should have taken 40 or 50 men apart. It didn't glorify. It didn't explain. It just existed, quietly, like the decision itself. I stood there longer than I meant to. Not proud. Not nostalgic. Only aware that history, when it chooses to remember, rarely remembers the person, just the angle of the turn. The numbers left standing. The line that continued because someone felt something was wrong and acted before certainty arrived. I left the museum without telling anyone the display meant anything to me. The war was full of men who made impossible choices, mine was only one among thousands. But sometimes, late at night in the garage, when an engine idled smoother than it should or a faint rattle warned of something hidden, I'd think of that fog-covered road in Belgium. A bend. A whisper of smoke. A flash of metal where none should be. A moment when rules felt small and instinct felt enormous. And the knowledge that history does not move by orders alone, it also moves by quiet decisions made in cold air by ordinary men who listen closely. I was never meant to change anything. I was a driver, one truck in a long line of trucks, one name among thousands printed on rosters that yellowed before the war even ended. But sometimes the road bends in a way the map doesn't show, and a man has to decide whether he trusts ink or instinct. That night in Belgium, I chose instinct. I turned the wheel, broke the rule, and felt the weight of 54 trucks follow me into darkness. I didn't know if the hidden road would hold, or if the mud would swallow us whole. I only knew the silence ahead was too perfect, too prepared, and that if I obeyed orders, we would drive straight into it. People say war is decided by generals. Maybe so. But I learned something else on that fog-bound ridge. Sometimes history shifts because an ordinary man feels danger before he can explain it. And chooses to turn anyway.